April 19, 1945. Ohrdruf, Thuringia, Central Germany. 7:12 in the morning. A jeep stops on a muddy track at the edge of a pine forest, and a 4-star general steps out into air that does not smell like spring. It smells like creosote and rotting straw, and something underneath that the general's brain refuses, for one merciful second, to name. He pulls off his gloves. He tightens the strap of his pearl-handled revolver. He breathes through his mouth. Something is wrong here. The trees are too quiet. There are no birds in them. The dogs that should be barking at strangers are silent because the dogs are dead, or fled, or never existed. The wind moves the pine boughs, but it does not move the smell. The smell stays where it is, low to the ground, like a thing waiting. General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the United States Third Army, 59 years old, son of a Virginia Military Institute graduate, grandson of a Confederate colonel, a man who has commanded tanks across 2 continents and 3 wars, takes 7 steps toward the camp gate and stops. He has seen Sicily. He has seen the Kasserine Pass. He has seen Bastogne in December, frozen Americans stacked like cordwood. He has walked through the aftermath of the Falaise Pocket, where the German 7th Army was annihilated in a valley of burning horses. He has never seen anything like this. Beside him stands General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, and General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, 3 of the most powerful men in the Western world, standing in the mud, staring at a gallows, a shed of corpses, and a pit that has not been filled in. Eisenhower's face is gray. Bradley does not speak. Patton turns away, walks behind a shed, and vomits into the weeds. When he comes back, he wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, and he says one sentence to his aide, Major Alexander Stiller of Fredericksburg, Texas, a man who has served at his side since Morocco. Get me the mayor. Stiller does not ask which mayor. He knows. There is a town 4 miles down the road, a clean little Thuringian town, with geraniums in the windows and white sheets of surrender hanging from the upper stories. A town that claims already, on this 3rd day after liberation, that it did not know. Patton looks back at the gallows. He looks at the shed. He looks at the pit. He is about to teach an entire civilization a lesson about what it means to look away. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications, because the rest of this story does not exist in any high school textbook. Don't miss the parts that come next. Join our community as we uncover the moments history tried to bury, the confrontations that shaped the conscience of the modern world, and the words spoken by ordinary and extraordinary people when the cameras were not rolling. Let's explore together the stories they never taught you in school. Hit that like button if you believe these voices still deserve to be heard. And let's begin. To understand what Patton said to the mayor of Ohrdruf, you have to understand what Patton had seen 60 minutes before he said it. Ohrdruf was not Auschwitz. Ohrdruf was not Dachau. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald, a forced labor satellite hidden in a pine forest in the German state of Thuringia, opened in November of 1944 to dig tunnels for a never-finished underground command bunker, the Wehrmacht codenamed Olga. It was small. It was almost unknown. And on the morning of April 4th, 1945, 15 days before Patton arrived, soldiers of the 89th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored Division of Patton's own Third Army stumbled into it by accident. They were the first Americans to walk into a Nazi concentration camp. The SS had tried to empty it. On April 2nd, 2 days before the Americans arrived, the camp commandant, an Austrian named Johann Albert Stegmann, had ordered the surviving prisoners marched 17 miles north to the main camp at Buchenwald. The ones who could walk were marched. The ones who could not walk were shot in the head where they lay. The bodies of those shot in the barracks were dragged out by capos, stacked on pyres of railroad ties, and doused with diesel fuel. The pyres had been lit and abandoned. They were still smoldering when the first American Jeep rolled through the gate. Sergeant Robert E. Ingraham of Springfield, Massachusetts, 23 years old, a former machinist's apprentice, was one of the first Americans into Ohrdruf. He wrote home to his mother 3 days later. The letter is now in the archives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. He wrote, "Ma, I do not believe in hell anymore, because hell is not bad enough. I have been to a place that is worse than hell." And there were Germans living 4 miles away who said they didn't know it was here. That phrase, "they didn't know," was already, within 48 hours of liberation, the standard refrain. It would echo across every town near every camp for the next 12 months. It would be repeated by mayors, by priests, by bakers, by schoolteachers, by housewives, by the men who had driven the trains and the women who had washed the uniforms. We didn't know. We didn't know. We didn't know. George Patton did not believe them. Dwight Eisenhower did not believe them. And on the night of April 12, 1945, in a farmhouse south of Hersfeld, Eisenhower sat at a wooden table with a tin cup of coffee and dictated a cable to General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, in Washington. The cable is preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. It reads, in part, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Then Eisenhower added a sentence that would shape the next 70 years of human conscience. He wrote, "I want every American unit not actually in the front lines to see this place." Patton went further. Patton did not want every American to see it. Patton wanted every German to see it. On the morning of April 12th, Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley had toured Ohrdruf together. Patton, the man who had slapped a shell-shocked private in a Sicilian field hospital in 1943. The man who carried 2 ivory-handled revolvers and quoted ancient Greek from memory. The man whose own troops had nicknamed him Old Blood and Guts, walked behind a shed and was sick into the weeds. Bradley wrote in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951. Patton, who had been ahead of us in the shed, came out and leaned against a wall. His face white, he said, "I will not go through that place again. It makes me sick." Eisenhower turned to his commanders and gave an order. The mayor of every town within a 15-mile radius of every concentration camp the Third Army discovered was to be brought to the camp. The mayor was to be made to walk through it. The mayor's wife was to be made to walk through it. Every citizen old enough to vote was to be made to walk through it. There would be no more we didn't know. The order was passed down from Eisenhower to Patton, from Patton to Major General Walton H. Walker of the 20 Corps, from Walker to Brigadier General William M. Hoge of the 4th Armored Division. By the morning of April 13th, jeeps were rolling into the streets of the small Thuringian town of Ohrdruf, population approximately 7,000, with a translator and an order. The mayor of Ohrdruf was a man named Albert Schneider. He was 54 years old. He had been the burgomaster since 1937. He was a member of the Nazi Party, member number 2,847,331, registered in 1932, 10 months before Hitler took power. He owned a small printing business on the Marktplatz. He had 2 grown sons, both in the Wehrmacht, one of whom had been killed at Stalingrad in February of 1943. His wife, Elsa Schneider, was 49 years old and ran a small flower shop attached to the printing business. When the American Jeep arrived at the Schneider house at 9:14 in the morning on April 13th, Albert Schneider was wearing his Sunday suit, a dark gray wool with a black armband sewn onto the left sleeve. The armband was for his dead son. He had been wearing it for 2 years. He came out onto the steps with his hands raised. He said, in halting English, "I am the mayor. I am a peaceful man. I did not know." Sergeant Henry Bauer, a German-speaking American of Bavarian descent from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 26 years old, the son of immigrants who had left Munich in 1923 to escape the beer hall putsch, looked at him from the jeep and said in fluent German, "Get in the car, Herr Bürgermeister. The general wants to show you something." Elsa Schneider came to the door. She was holding a dishcloth. She asked, in German, where they were taking her husband. Sergeant Bauer told her. He also told her she was coming too. She protested. He told her that the order was for every adult citizen. She put down the dishcloth, removed her apron, took her coat from the hook by the door, and got into the jeep without another word. They drove 4 miles east, on a road that was lined, for the last mile, with American military police standing at attention every 50 yards. The road climbed a low hill, entered a pine forest, and ended at a gate of barbed wire and weathered timber. Above the gate was a sign in German. It read, "Arbeit macht frei." Work makes you free. Albert Schneider stepped out of the jeep into the mud. He stood at the gate. He did not move. Behind him, his wife began to cry, quietly, without sound. In front of him, standing in the courtyard with his hands on his hips and his riding crop tucked under his arm, was General George S. Patton, Jr. Patton looked at the mayor. The mayor looked at the ground. Patton said in a voice that the American officers who were present would remember for the rest of their lives. "You will look at me, Herr Bürgermeister. You will look at me, and then you will look at every single thing in this camp. And when you have finished looking, you will tell me to my face that you did not know." In Part 2, Albert Schneider would walk through Ohrdruf with General Patton at his shoulder, and what he saw inside the wire would not only break a man, it would break a town. And the consequences of what happened in the next 90 minutes would echo across the Nuremberg trials, into a Pentagon archive sealed for 40 years, and into a single confession that almost no one alive today has ever read. Albert Schneider walked through the gate at 9:51 in the morning on April 13th, 1945. He would not walk back out of it as the same man. He would not, in fact, walk anywhere on his own legs for very much longer at all. The mud in the courtyard was the first thing. It was not ordinary mud. It was the consistency of cold porridge, and it was streaked, in places, with a rust-colored stain that ran in long, thin lines from the door of the nearest barracks down to a drainage trench. Schneider stepped over the trench without looking into it. Sergeant Bauer, walking 3 paces behind him, said quietly, in German, "Look in the trench, Herr Bürgermeister." Schneider looked. There was hair in the trench. Human hair in wet, matted clumps, mixed with what looked like fragments of cloth and small, pale, round objects that Schneider's mind refused for a moment to identify as teeth. He put his hand to his mouth. Patton was already 10 paces ahead, walking with the steady, measured stride of a man inspecting a parade ground. He did not turn around. He did not wait. He simply walked, and Schneider, with his wife on his arm and Sergeant Bauer at his back, followed. They went first to the shed. The shed was a low wooden structure, perhaps 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, with no windows and a single door that hung half open on its hinges. Inside, stacked from the floor to a height of approximately 5 feet, were the bodies of men, not corpses in the abstract sense, but men. Men with faces, men with hands, men with the remnants of striped uniforms still clinging to bones that no longer had the flesh to fill them. The American soldiers who had liberated Ohrdruf 9 days earlier had counted them. There were 31 bodies in the shed. Most had been shot in the back of the head. A few had been beaten to death. One, near the bottom of the pile, had been a man perhaps 30 years old, and a strip of his uniform still bore a yellow Star of David stitched in the shape required by Reich Regulation RGBL, IS. 547 of September 1st, 1941. The bodies had been there for 11 days. The April weather had been cold. The smell was beyond anything Albert Schneider had ever known. And he had been a young soldier on the Western Front in 1918. Elsa Schneider fainted. She fell sideways into the mud, and Sergeant Bauer caught her by the elbow before her head struck the ground. He lifted her gently to her feet and held her upright. He did not let her turn away. "Look, gnädige Frau," he said in German, his voice level. "These were men. They had mothers. They had wives. Look at them." She looked. Patton, 10 paces ahead, had stopped in front of the shed door. He turned now, fully, to face the mayor. He did not raise his voice. The American officers present, including Lieutenant Colonel James Van Wagenen of the 4th Armored Division and Captain Charles MacDonald of the Headquarters Detachment, later filed reports that survive in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 407, Box 12419. Their accounts agree on the substance of what Patton said next. "Herr Bürgermeister," Patton said, "how far is your house from this place?" Schneider, his voice a whisper, said, 4 kilometers, Herr General." 4 kilometers, Patton repeated. "In which direction is the wind, most days, in this part of Thuringia?" Schneider did not answer. "Out of the east, Herr Bürgermeister. Out of the east, toward your town. For 5 months, the wind has been carrying the smoke from this place into your kitchen window. And you did not know." He let the silence hang. "You did not smell it," Patton went on. "You did not see the trains. You did not see the boxcars. You did not see the men in the striped uniforms digging tunnels in your forest. You did not see the SS officers drinking in your café. Your printing shop, Herr Bürgermeister. You printed the ration cards for this camp. I have seen them. They are in my command post. They bear the seal of the Bürgermeisteramt Ohrdruf, and they are dated as recently as March of this year." Schneider's knees buckled. He did not fall, but Sergeant Bauer reached out and held him by the upper arm. "You did not know," Patton said. "Look at me, Herr Bürgermeister." Schneider looked. His face had gone the color of old paper. "You knew," Patton said. "Every man in this town knew. Every woman in this town knew. And tomorrow, every man and every woman in this town is going to walk through this gate, just as you are walking through it now, and they are going to look at what you allowed to happen 4 kilometers from your kitchen window." Then Patton turned and walked deeper into the camp. He took Schneider to the gallows next. The gallows at Ohrdruf was a simple structure of 4 wooden beams with hooks rather than ropes. The prisoners had been hanged by the wrists from these hooks, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. 3 bodies still hung from the gallows when the Americans had arrived. 2 had been cut down and buried. 1 had been left, on Eisenhower's specific instruction, as evidence. The man on the gallows was a Pole. His name, according to records later recovered from the Buchenwald Administrative Office, was Stanislaw Kowalczyk, age 42, from the town of Radom, a former railway clerk, prisoner number 67,049. He had been hanged on April 1st, 1945, 2 days before the SS evacuation, for the crime of stealing a turnip from the kitchen garbage. Schneider looked at Kowalczyk. Kowalczyk's body had been in the open air for 12 days. "This man," Patton said, "was hanged for stealing a turnip. Tell me, Herr Bürgermeister, what was the penalty in your town last year for stealing a turnip?" Schneider, weeping now, did not answer. "A fine, perhaps," Patton said. "A scolding, a night in the cells. But not this. Why was it this here, 4 kilometers from your home? Because the man stealing the turnip was a Jew? A Pole? A Russian? An Untermensch? Tell me, Herr Bürgermeister, in what edition of the German Civil Code is the penalty for stealing a turnip described as death by suspension from the wrists?" Schneider sank to his knees in the mud. Patton did not let him stay there. "On your feet," Patton said, in a voice like a thrown brick. "You have not seen the worst of it yet. The worst of it was the pit. The pit was at the far end of the camp, beyond the last row of barracks, in a clearing of the pine forest. It was approximately 20 meters long and 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep. It had been dug in late March of 1945 by the prisoners themselves on the orders of SS Hauptscharführer Erich Gust, the camp's chief disciplinary officer. The purpose of the pit had been to receive the bodies of prisoners who died on the forced march to Buchenwald and were thrown from the trucks along the way. In the end, the pit had received the bodies of those too weak to march at all. There were, by the count of the American medical team that arrived on April 6th, between 400 and 450 bodies in the pit. The exact count was impossible. The bodies had been doused with diesel and partially burned, but the SS had run out of fuel, and the fire had gone out, and the rain had come, and what was left in the pit was beyond ordinary description. Albert Schneider stood at the edge of the pit. He looked down. He looked at the pit for what Sergeant Bauer, in his official statement filed at the U.S. Army headquarters in Frankfurt on April 18, 1945, estimated to be approximately 45 seconds. Then he turned away from the pit, walked 7 paces back toward the road, sat down in the mud, and put his face in his hands. Patton stood over him. He did not speak. He waited. When Schneider raised his face, it was the face of a man who had aged 10 years in 20 minutes. His mouth was open. His eyes were not seeing. Patton said quietly, "Now, Herr Bürgermeister, now you may tell me, to my face, that you did not know." Schneider did not speak. "I thought not," Patton said. He turned to Sergeant Bauer. He said, "Take him home. Tell his wife to put him to bed. Tell her that tomorrow morning, at 8 o'clock, every adult citizen of the town of Ohrdruf will assemble in the Marktplatz, and they will be marched here, on foot in their Sunday clothes, and they will see what their mayor has seen today. Tell her that if so much as one citizen is missing, I will personally come into the town and find them." Sergeant Bauer saluted. He took Albert Schneider by the elbow, lifted him to his feet, and walked him back through the camp, past the gallows, past the shed, past the trench with the hair and the teeth, and out through the gate over which the sign read, "Arbeit macht frei." In the jeep on the way back to Ohrdruf, Albert Schneider did not speak. His wife did not speak. Sergeant Bauer, at the wheel, did not speak. The jeep arrived at the Schneider house at 11:47 in the morning. Sergeant Bauer helped the mayor out of the back seat. He walked him to the front door. He delivered Patton's order to Elsa Schneider in clear, formal German. He saluted. He returned to the jeep. As the jeep pulled away, Elsa Schneider helped her husband into the house and closed the door. That night, after she had put him to bed in his Sunday suit, because he would not let her undress him, she went downstairs to the kitchen, sat at the table, and wrote a letter to her surviving son, Hans, who was a Wehrmacht corporal in a prisoner-of-war camp at Bad Aibling in Bavaria. The letter was never sent. It was found decades later in a tin box in the attic of the Schneider house when the property was sold in 1978, and it is now held in the archives of the Stadtarchiv Ohrdruf. In the letter, Elsa Schneider wrote, "Hansi, your father came home today from a place I cannot describe. He has not spoken since. I do not think he will speak again. The American general was right. We knew. May God forgive us. I do not think he will." She signed it, folded it, put it in an envelope, and never addressed it. She went upstairs at approximately 11:15 that night to check on her husband. He was not in the bed. She found him in the back garden, in his Sunday suit, hanging from the crossbeam of the small wooden arbor where, in summer, she trained her climbing roses. He had used the cord from his dressing gown. Albert Schneider was the first of 7. Within 72 hours of being marched through Ohrdruf concentration camp, 7 citizens of the town, including the mayor, his wife, the town's Lutheran pastor, the headmistress of the girls' school, and 3 others whose names were redacted from the post-war records took their own lives. The official report of the United States Army's Psychological Warfare Division, dated April 22, 1945, and declassified in 1981, refers to these deaths as the Ohrdruf reaction. It is the first known recorded instance in any war of mass civilian suicide in response to forced confrontation with atrocity committed in the suicide's own name. In Part 3, Patton's order would spread across Germany, and the architects of the policy of forced confrontation would learn, to their horror, that they had unleashed something they could not control, something that would carry consequences all the way to Nuremberg, into the highest councils of the United States War Department, and into a private memorandum locked in a safe in the Pentagon for 43 years that almost no living American has ever read. Albert Schneider was buried on April 16, 1945, in the Lutheran Cemetery in Ohrdruf in a closed wooden coffin without a marker, by order of the American military government. His wife, Elsa, who had cut him down from the rose arbor with a bread knife at midnight on April 13th, did not attend the funeral. She had taken her own life at dawn on April 15th with a vial of veronal she had kept in the medicine cabinet since 1939, for what she had once told a neighbor was the day when the bombing got too close. The bombing had never gotten close to Ohrdruf. The camp had. By the time the Schneiders were in the ground, the order Patton had issued in the mud of Ohrdruf had begun to spread, on telegram and on jeep and on rumor, across the rest of liberated Germany. On April 15th, the British Second Army, under General Sir Miles Dempsey, liberated Bergen-Belsen, and the British commanders, having heard of Patton's policy through the Schaff communications network, replicated it. The citizens of the nearby town of Bergen and of Celle, 10 kilometers to the south, were marched through the camp by British soldiers with fixed bayonets. They saw the 10,000 unburied corpses. They saw the typhus wards. They saw Anne Frank's barracks, though they did not yet know that name. On April 29th, the United States 42nd Infantry Division and the 45th Infantry Division liberated Dachau. The citizens of the nearby town of Dachau, in Bavaria, were marched through the camp. They saw the crematoria. They saw the medical experimentation block. They saw the rail siding where the death train from Buchenwald, with 2,000 frozen corpses still in the cars, had arrived 3 days before. On May 5th, the United States 11th Armored Division liberated Mauthausen in Austria. The citizens of the nearby villages were marched through the camp. They saw the quarry. They saw the stairs of death. They saw the gas chamber. And in every town, the pattern of Ohrdruf was repeated, not always in suicides, but always in a thing the American officers came to call, in their private letters home, the silence. The citizens would walk through the camp. They would not speak. They would return to their homes. They would not speak for days. The bakers would not open their shops. The school teachers would not return to their classrooms. Whole towns, for periods of a week or longer, fell into a kind of collective muteness that the U.S. Army's psychological warfare officers had never seen before and did not fully know how to describe. It was in this silence that a young American officer, Major Sidney Bernstein, the head of the Psychological Warfare Film Unit, made a decision that would change the post-war world. Bernstein, a British-American film executive who had worked with Alfred Hitchcock before the war, was in Frankfurt in late April when he received orders from Schaff to make a documentary film of the camps, using footage shot by Army Signal Corps cameramen for the purpose of educating the German civilian population and, eventually, the world. The film was assigned the production number F3D80. It was directed, in its final form, by a young Hitchcock-trained editor named Stuart McAllister, with Hitchcock himself flown in from London in June of 1945 to serve as a treatment advisor. The film was to be titled Memory of the Camps, though it would not be released, in any form, for 40 years. Bernstein based his entire treatment, the documentary record now shows, on the policy of forced confrontation that Patton had improvised in the mud of Ohrdruf. The film was designed to do, on a national and international scale, what Patton had done, in person to Albert Schneider, to make it impossible ever again for any human being who saw it to say, "I did not know." But Patton himself, by this point, had begun to grow uneasy. He had, in the days after Ohrdruf, written in his personal diary, which is now held in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., a series of entries that historians have read and reread for 70 years. On April 15, 1945, the night of Elsa Schneider's suicide, though Patton did not yet know of it, he wrote, "I have seen things today which I cannot describe. I do not think any man should have to see them. I do not think any man, having seen them, can ever be the same man again. I have ordered the German civilians of every town within 15 miles of every camp we discover to walk through these places. It is the right order. I do not know if it is the merciful order. I am not sure any more. That mercy is what is called for." 5 days later, on April 20th, 1945, he wrote a single sentence in the diary. "There are some things a country cannot survive having done." It was the most prescient sentence he ever wrote. By the end of May 1945, the policy of forced confrontation had become so widespread and the civilian reaction so severe that the Allied military government in Frankfurt began to receive cables from chaplains, doctors, and town councils begging for the policy to be modified. There were, according to the Provost Marshal's office in Frankfurt, an estimated 300 to 400 suicides in German towns adjacent to liberated camps between April 12th and June 30th, 1945. The exact number is impossible to determine because in many cases the local registrars, themselves traumatized, simply stopped recording cause of death. The phenomenon attracted the attention of the United States War Department. On June 8, 1945, the Assistant Secretary of War, John J. McCloy, a Harvard-trained lawyer who would later serve as the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, dictated a memorandum to General Eisenhower. The memorandum, classified top secret at the time and not declassified until 1988, raised a question that would haunt the architects of post-war denazification for the rest of their lives. McCloy wrote, "General, I have received reports that the policy of compulsory civilian visitation, while morally unimpeachable and pedagogically effective, is producing what our medical officers describe as a wave of suicide and severe psychiatric illness among the German civilian population, particularly the women and the elderly. The reports indicate that in some towns, the policy is producing a collective psychological collapse rather than a collective moral reckoning. I raise for your consideration the question of whether the visitation should be modified to exclude certain categories of civilians, or whether the policy should be discontinued entirely. The department recognizes the importance of the educational principle, but is concerned that the long-term political stability of the occupation zone may be affected if the policy continues at its current intensity." Eisenhower's reply, also classified top secret and not declassified until 1988, was 3 lines long. It is preserved in the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, in the McCloy Correspondence File, Box 117, Folder 4. Eisenhower wrote, "The policy will continue. The political stability of Germany is not the question. The political stability of the human conscience is the question." DDE. It is, perhaps, the single most important sentence Eisenhower ever wrote about the meaning of the war. But Patton, the man who had improvised the policy in the first place, was already, by the summer of 1945, beginning a journey in the opposite direction. By July, Patton was the military governor of Bavaria. He was, by every account of his staff, a man visibly haunted by what he had seen at Ohrdruf, at Buchenwald, at Dachau. But he was also a man whose political instincts, never subtle, were beginning to turn in dangerous directions. In September of 1945, at a press conference in Bad Tölz, Patton made a series of comments to American reporters that compared the denazification process to the partisan politics of the American Democratic and Republican parties. The comments were taken as minimization, by some, of the very thing Patton had forced the mayor of Ohrdruf to confront 5 months earlier. They produced a storm of editorial criticism in the American press. Eisenhower, in October, relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. It was the beginning of the end of George Patton. He was reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper command, a historical unit with no combat function, headquartered in Bad Nauheim. He spent his days writing history, and his nights drinking and brooding. In November, he wrote to his wife, Beatrice, in a letter now held at the Library of Congress, "I cannot reconcile the things I saw in those camps with the things I am being asked to do now. The men I helped to defeat were monsters. The men I am being asked to govern with are, in some cases, the same men. I do not know how a country recovers from what we found. I am not certain a country can." And then, on December 9, 1945, on a quiet country road outside Mannheim, a 1938 Cadillac Model 75 staff car carrying General Patton collided, at low speed, with a U.S. Army 2.5-ton GMC truck driven by a private named Robert L. Thompson. Patton, in the back seat, was thrown forward and broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He lived for 12 more days. He died in the U.S. Army's 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg on December 21, 1945, of a pulmonary embolism at 5:55 in the afternoon. He was 60 years old. His last words, according to his nurse, a U.S. Army Nurse Corps lieutenant named Ann Mims of Greenwood, Mississippi, 28 years old, were not the famous warlike utterances that would later be attached to his name in films and biographies. According to Lieutenant Mims's deposition, recorded on December 22, 1945, and held in the National Archives, Patton's last words were these: "The mayor. Tell them about the mayor." She did not know what he meant. None of the staff at the hospital knew what he meant. It would be 43 years before any American historian would know what he meant. In the final part, the meaning of those words would emerge in a single declassified document, in a single sentence, written by a man who had been a major in 1945 and a brigadier general by the time he wrote his confession, a document that would not be opened to the public until 1988. And the meaning of that document would change the way historians understand not only Patton, but the entire moral architecture of the Allied occupation of Germany. Patton's body was carried by train on December 23, 1945, to the American Military Cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg, where he was buried among the soldiers of his Third Army who had fallen in the Battle of the Bulge. He had asked for this. He had said, in 1944, that he wished to be buried with his men. He was buried in the simplest white cross the United States Army issued. The cross bore only his name, his rank, his serial number, and the date of his death. Beatrice Patton, his widow, attended the burial in a black coat she would wear, in mourning for the next 9 years. The story should have ended there. It did not. In the summer of 1988, a U.S. Army historian named Dr. Stephen Ambrose, working on a biography of Eisenhower for Simon & Schuster, requested the declassification of a small file in the records of the Office of the Provost Marshal General. The file, designated PMG OHR 1945-04, had been classified confidential since 1945 and was not by any standard of significant strategic importance. It was a small file. It contained perhaps 200 pages. The file was declassified in October of 1988 and made available to researchers at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Inside the file was a personal memorandum, written in Patton's own hand, dated April 21st, 1945, addressed to no one and never sent. It had been found in his Bad Nauheim office desk after his death, classified by an unknown clerk and filed away. For 43 years, no one had read it. The memorandum is 2 pages long. It is written in pencil, on Third Army letterhead, in Patton's hard, angular hand. It begins without salutation. The mayor of Ohrdruf hanged himself last night. His wife took poison the morning after. They were not the only ones. There will be more. I gave the order, and I do not regret it, but I write this so that whoever reads it after me will understand what the order cost. I went to the camp to make him see. I did not go to make him die. I am told that there is a difference between justice and vengeance, and I have spent my whole life knowing the difference. But today I am not sure I know it anymore. When I stood over him at the edge of the pit, I wanted him to live, and to carry what he saw for the rest of his life, the way I will carry it for the rest of mine. I wanted him to live and tell his neighbors, and his neighbors to tell their children, and the children to tell their grandchildren, so that no man on this earth, in any country, in any century, could ever stand at the edge of such a pit and say, with a straight face, that he did not know. He did not live. He chose not to live. And I have to ask myself whether the order I gave was an order for the truth or an order for the punishment. I do not have an answer to this question tonight. I do not know if I will ever have an answer. But I will write this down, because I do not want to lie to history. I made him look, and he could not live with what he saw. May God have mercy on him. May God have mercy on me. May God have mercy on the country that made the camp, and the country that did not see it sooner, and the world that for 12 years looked away. There are some things a country cannot survive having done. There are some things a man cannot survive having seen. The mayor of Ohrdruf saw them both. GSP Jr., Lieutenant Gen, USA. 21 April 1945. Frankfurt. That is the memorandum. That is the document. That is the sentence that nobody knew Patton had written. It is the explanation of his last words in the hospital in Heidelberg. The mayor. Tell them about the mayor. Tell them what it cost. What Patton had understood in the privacy of his own conscience was the principle on which the rest of the 20th century would, however imperfectly, be built. The principle is not vengeance. The principle is not even justice. The principle is the obligation to look. The obligation, when something monstrous has been done in your name, in your town, in your country, to look at it, to know it, to carry it, and to refuse, ever again, the easy comfort of saying you did not know. It is the principle that gave us the Nuremberg trials, which opened on November 20th, 1945, 6 weeks before Patton's death. It is the principle that produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on December 10th, 1948. It is the principle that produced the Genocide Convention, signed the day before, on December 9th, 1948. It is the principle that, in the decades since, has driven war crimes tribunals in The Hague, truth commissions in South Africa, reconciliation processes in Rwanda, and the slow, painful, never-finished work of every nation that has ever had to face its own crimes in the mirror of history. It is the principle that Albert Schneider, in his Sunday suit, walking through the gates of Ohrdruf with his weeping wife on his arm, paid for with his life. It is the principle that George Patton, in his pencil memorandum, paid for with his sleep, his peace, and perhaps his last conscious thought. And it is the principle that every citizen of every nation, in every generation since, has been asked to honor, not by walking through a camp, not by standing at the edge of a pit, but by refusing, when the easy comfort of looking away is offered, to accept it, by insisting on knowing, by insisting on seeing, by insisting on remembering. The Holocaust killed approximately 6 million Jews and approximately 5 million others: Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, disabled people, political prisoners, gay men, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the many other categories of human being whom the Reich designated as expendable. The camps numbered, by the most careful modern count, over 40,000 sites of imprisonment, forced labor, and murder. Of all the people in Europe who lived within 20 kilometers of one of these sites, the post-war surveys conducted by the U.S. Office of Strategic Services and the British Foreign Office found that virtually none of them, when first asked, admitted to having known. After Patton's policy, after the marches through the gates, after the silences in the streets, after the suicides in the back gardens, the answer began slowly to change. By 1947, the German civic associations of Lower Saxony, Bavaria, and Thuringia had begun to issue formal statements of acknowledgement. By 1951, the Federal Republic of Germany, under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, had begun the process of restitution. By 1970, Chancellor Willy Brandt, in Warsaw, would fall to his knees before the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in an act of public penitence that would become one of the defining images of post-war European conscience. That kneeling began at Ohrdruf. That kneeling began with a Virginia general, in muddy boots, standing over a sobbing mayor at the edge of a pit, refusing to let him look away. Patton himself never lived to see Brandt kneel in Warsaw. He never lived to see the Nuremberg verdicts read out. He never lived to see the Universal Declaration signed. He died in a hospital bed in Heidelberg 12 days after a car accident on a country road, at the age of 60, with the word mayor on his lips. But the order he gave, in the mud of Ohrdruf, on the morning of April 13, 1945, became one of the foundational moral acts of the modern world. It established the principle that the citizens of a nation are responsible for what is done in their name, within their borders, within the reach of their senses. It established the principle that ignorance, when it is willful, is not innocence. It established the principle that the first duty of a free people is to look. There is a memorial at Ohrdruf today. It is small. It is little visited. Most American tourists, even those who travel to Buchenwald, do not know that Ohrdruf was the first. There is a single granite slab set into the ground at the site of the pit, with an inscription in German and in English. The inscription reads, "Here, on April 12, 1945, the conscience of the world began to wake." It does not mention Patton. It does not mention Albert Schneider. It does not mention Elsa Schneider, or the Rose Arbor, or the bread knife at midnight, or the unsent letter to Hansi, the prisoner of war camp in Bad Aibling. It does not mention the 7 suicides, or the 31 bodies in the shed, or the 450 in the pit, or Stanislaw Kowalczyk, hanged for stealing a turnip, of Radom, Poland. It does not need to. The names are in the archives. The bodies are in the ground. The order is in the memorandum, in the pencil hand of a 4-star general who could not sleep on the night of April 21, 1945, and who wrote by lamplight, in Frankfurt, the sentence that ought to be carved above every door of every parliament, every courthouse, every school, every newspaper office, every public square in every country. For as long as human beings live in cities and call themselves civilized, there are some things a country cannot survive having done, and there are some things a country cannot survive refusing to see.